This is the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heening. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome to another edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Rob Riches, and it's been quite a week. We last recorded the night that the news was released that Ron Hextall was no longer the GM of the Flyers. Since then, we've heard from Paul Holmgren and Dave Scott. We've seen two more firings. We've seen two more games with different results for the team that's currently playing on the ice. We've heard from Hextall himself on the way out, and we found out who the new GM will be, all in the course of 7 days. We're going to get to all of this on this week's show. So let's kind of start at the beginning, recapping what we had talked about last week. And it was a lot of talk about Ron Hextall being fired by the team as general manager. And at that time, Rob, it was a lot of speculation. We just didn't have any clear evidence as to why this happened. We assumed it was more or less performance-based, but there was certainly going to be other underlying factors. We assumed that he wasn't willing to make a change of some kind to this team. We assumed that he was unwilling to change his plan in some way that maybe forced the Flyers to go straight with axing him first instead of something like a coaching change or a player decision or something of that nature. And we waited for what was to come. We started to kind of think about where everything was going to go. You looked at some of the names that were out there. We briefly mentioned a few, but we really couldn't get into potential candidates or anything like that because news was still so fresh. We didn't really have time to get into that. So when you go through the whole rest of the week that was, let me give you kind of my perspective on it as I covered this throughout the week and kind of every day had another new story or new angle to take on the whole deal. And it really started the next day on Tuesday with the press conference for Paul Holmgren and Dave Scott. They come out, and by the way, while you're sitting there processing the whole decision, it's patience ran out on Ron Hextall. He was too patient. He wouldn't make a move. That's probably why it happens. You're wondering about the status of the coaching staff, Dave Hextall. What's going to happen to him? This was Hextall's guy. So what happens to him? Paul Holmgren and Dave Scott come out and basically give the impression that the idea was that they wanted to see more results by now, and when the results aren't coming, you want to see action taken to get you those results in some way. Now, that being said, one of the things I thought out of that press conference was that we didn't get a lot of answers to any of the questions. We didn't know the reasoning behind it. About the only thing we got out of is that they wanted a GM who will take action. They noted the philosophical differences in the approach to getting better. And they mentioned, Paul Holmgren specifically mentioning, that Hextall was unyielding in his plan and very stubborn towards it. The next day, the Flyers fire assistant GM Chris Pryor and assistant coach Gord Murphy. It all kind of leaked out slowly but surely that day. There was a couple of decisions, as you saw, as the whole day went on. Calvin Pickard wasn't on the ice for practice, and the idea was, or the speculation was right away, he was placed on waivers. That happened. Tyrell Goulbourne wasn't on the ice, and the idea was he was sent down. So there was going to be a roster decision being made somewhere. He was the extra forward at the time. It was probably likely. And it was interesting. When they pointed out that that an assistant coach, Gord Murphy's not on the ice either, you knew something was up. And basically, the development at that time was just waiting for the Flyers to kind of come out and say it. Yeah, Gord Murphy got fired, and we're short one assistant coach for now, and we'll see where that goes. When they actually put a release out and made a change, it wasn't just Gord Murphy, it was also Chris Pryor, the assistant GM, who, quite frankly, had a lot to do with the behind the scenes and the legwork of the drafts under Ron Hextall and making some of these selections for prospect players that are highly touted in the organization. That was met with a little bit of criticism because this is a guy who, for the better part of 20 years, with certain drafts, proved to be a valuable asset, even beyond the Hextall years. You go before the Hextall years and you think Claude Giroux was a first-round pick. You think about some of the other first-round picks that did have success. Mike Richards and Jeff Carter were successful in the city for a time. Guys like that, go back even further. Think guys like Simone Gagne. Chances are Chris Pryor was involved in some way, either as director of scouting or dealing with player personnel. He had his hands all over the team, in some way, shape, or form. His fingerprints were on this team for the better part of 2 decades. So that change happens. Then the Flyers start the interview process, and right away we heard the name Chuck Fletcher. And the idea was that Chuck Fletcher was the front runner, the leader all the way through the process, and somebody was going to have to really impress to take this job away from him. And as would be the case, as we learned on Monday, Chuck Fletcher is in fact the new GM of the Philadelphia Flyers. The 8th different GM they've had. He's the 9th overall, technically, if you factor in the different tenures of the previous GMs. Bobby Clarke was a GM twice in the franchise's history at different time periods, so technically counted as two different terms, if you will. Not to go political here with that, but 2 different terms. Either way, this is the 8th different GM, and it's the first GM that has that complete outside perspective of the organization. Never had a job with this organization before, and this is the first guy who's never had that, hasn't had that in 28 years. This goes all the way back to the Russ Farwell days, and the idea that this is somebody who's got an outside perspective, somebody who can come in, observe the situation, and make his own decisions from here. In the meantime, by the way, while all these interviews were going on, Chuck Fletcher came in on Thursday, I believe it was, for his, and they had a couple other candidates. I believe Bill Zito was one, and he had an interview on Saturday. That much I know. Dave Nonis from Anaheim was also a candidate, I believe, interviewed, but there was never really any specifics on that process, so I don't know how serious he was ever considered. Zito was definitely the runner-up, and Fletcher was clearly the guy. It was his job to lose, as we heard several times, and he didn't lose it. So in the meantime, though, while all that's going on, Ron Hextall did hold a press conference on Friday to kind of give his side of the story, because let's face it, the whole week that goes on, you're getting different perspectives of what it was like for Ron Hextall to run the Flyers. And from what we can gather, Ron Hextall was a micromanager. He wanted his say on just about everything, and he controlled a lot of what went through with this team. And it seemed milder on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday as some of this stuff was surfacing the first time. Then Hextall comes out and speaks and kind of downplays all of that and pushes it aside and goes, I don't know where that's coming from, where these allegations are coming from, that I was this and I was that. He was shocked by the firing himself because he didn't really see it coming. I guess he never really felt the heat from anybody in ownership, but apparently he needed to. And he assured throughout the process he was aggressive in trying to make some decisions, or not make decisions, but to try to make the team better and make the right decisions for the team now and in the future. And ultimately, though, the part that I keep having a problem with when Hextall talks about this is that he keeps talking about the short and long term of it. And it's like you're being too picky about what's being presented to you. At some point in time, you're either going to decide that you really want to take a step forward and make this team a little bit better. And sometimes like I don't downplay that in a trade scenario. If you don't want to give up a player for somebody who's in his 30s, I totally get that. But when it came to free agents, I was a little bit baffled by that. You don't want to lock yourself into a long-term thing, but you also don't want to push guys away by sitting here being so unwilling to do anything that goes against this plan that you possibly left a guy who could help your team out go to some other team and be that guy. You never know. The thing about Hextall is that in the time since that press conference, even more information has come out. Rob, I'm sure you've seen the Crossing Broad article by now, and I referenced it in a piece on Monday that, ironically enough, we published about 2 hours before the reports came out about Chuck Fletcher getting the GM job, or the idea that he was going to be named the GM. And the idea is that, from what I can gather, here's what I'll say about Ron Hextall. The thing about Ron Hextall is this, at this point. There's been a lot of comparisons to other figures in Philadelphia sports that never got to really see their vision all the way through. Hextall's getting comparisons to the likes of Sam Hinkie, Chip Kelly, guys who had their perception of how it was going to be done. They had a way that they thought could win, that they thought could get a team to the finish line. And at the end of the day, it just didn't work out, or the timeline wasn't right, or there were too many feathers ruffled sometimes for it to work. In the end, I kind of compared Hextall to both in a way, because Sam Hinkie had the process, and it was the process, and nothing was going to change the process. We're going to follow the process. And Ron Hextall certainly had his process and his plan to get this team back to contention. Chip Kelly had an innovative way to try to tackle the NFL that didn't always work. But more than anything, he wanted control. He wanted power. And it turned into a power struggle that ultimately led to him losing his job when the results were also not there. That's what I think you have here. You have a guy who stuck to his plan so much that it was not going to change. And when the results weren't there, it was so much more about it. It was about so much more than just the results. It was about a power struggle. He wanted control of all sorts of different aspects. To sit there and find out that he maybe had assistant coaches like Gord Murphy be his eyes and ears in the locker room, be spies to these players, to coaches, to trainers, to anybody who worked for the organization. He wanted control over how the team was perceived in the media. He wanted control over a whole lot of things. And it's kind of crazy to think about. And that's where I start to understand why this had to happen. You know, if all this is really true, then this does have to happen, because there was no way this was a healthy environment for the players, the coaches, anybody. And to sit there and possibly also sit there, it's interesting. I've got a little bit of a new perspective on Dave Haxtell as well. I don't like his system, or what I perceive to be his system, and I don't like the way that the team has played under him over the last 2 to 3 years. But I'm also not going to sit there and act like he's not a little bit of a victim in this, because the results also reflect him. And I'm sitting here as I'm wondering this, I'm going, if Ron Hextall had that much control over the coaching decisions and the players and everything that went on around the locker room and closing the locker room off and don't do this, don't do that, you have to eat like this and go to sleep at this time and do it this way and live your life this particular way, and everything around the organization is going to happen like this. If that's how Ron Hextall was, then I don't know how much of what happened on the ice was really Dave Haxtell. If anything, you feel a little bit bad for Dave Haxtell that he had to answer to the media, to the way that the fans reacted, for decisions that might not have been his. We don't know that, and it's really hard to tell when he's only had 2 games to really coach on his own, especially one that happened the day after the GM got fired. So it's really hard to perceive what is him and what's not, and we'll find that out in the coming weeks, because you're going to learn now Chuck Fletcher's going to be hands-off with Dave Haxtell for the time being. He's going to let him coach this team the way that Haxtell wants to try to maybe coach this team, and we'll see where it goes. But to continually ask for Dave Haxtell's head on a platter when he hasn't really maybe had the chance to coach this team the way he wanted to, and I also twist it back. I had this thought the other day. I twist it back even further. Go back to when Haxtell was hired as head coach. This was the head coaching hire that Ron Hextall made. There's a reason why, now that you think about it, there's a reason why the Flyers didn't go out that year and that offseason knowing they needed a new head coach and hire Mike Babcock or hire Todd McClellan or hire somebody else who was on the market that particular offseason. He wasn't going to hire a guy who he couldn't have control over. If the Flyers hired Mike Babcock to be the head coach 4 years ago, do you think Ron Hextall's input's going to matter to the head coach who has been there, done that, and controlled the team and run a team for that long behind the bench? Absolutely not. And he needed a fresh-faced guy who came from college, who had no background in the NHL. Nobody even really, there were a lot of people who didn't know who he was. And there was a little bit more control for Ron Hextall at that point. There was a little bit more of a way to control this guy, to let him be your puppet. And you'll do it the way that I think we need to do it. And I don't know how long that was going on for. I don't know if that happened from year 1 under Dave Haxtall or if it happened further down the line, because I thought that the first year that the Flyers played under Dave Haxtall wasn't a terrible year, and they made the playoffs that year, and it was above expectations. But from there, I wonder how hardened Ron Hextall was in his plan to not add any pieces at the cost of the future, and to keep control over the way that the games were coached and the way that the lineups looked and things of that nature, that could be the reason why the Flyers have been on again, off again, on again, miss the playoffs, make the playoffs, that kind of thing, So I'm curious to see how that goes. This is year 4. You're trying to stay in the playoff picture, and for all intents and purposes, you are still in the playoff picture. You're not out of this by any stretch here, and you've got a team that's, let's this way, good enough to win a game on occasion here right now, to win, I'd say 50% of your games. It's not a great percentage, and it's not getting, and sometimes you're not getting it done the way that you'd like to see them get it done, but all of this matters. So at this point, trying to put a wrap on this week has been a little confusing because there's a lot of things that come into play. Rob, let me get your thoughts here on this, because there's a lot of things to kind of dissect. I think the first thing I want to start with is knowing what we know now, all these things that came out about Ron Hextall, what's being said and what people are assuming and what speculation says and all of this, all these stories. Was this now the right decision to get rid of Ron Hextall if this was the way things were going?
Honestly, the thing about the Hextall allegations is that I'm kind of curious as to how commonplace that is, not just in the rest of the NHL, but in professional sports as well. You know, we get a day and age where there's unprecedented access to just about everything that goes on in pro sports. We have social media, digital media outlets, such as SportsTalkPhilly.com. There's all sorts of different things that come out. You have players that are, a lot more active on social media these days. It's a situation kind of that reminds me of the Colangelo situation where, he was found to have all those burner accounts and really keeping track of the team and, talking about the team through Twitter burner accounts. And it's one of those things that you look at and you figure that's definitely commonplace because, in a day and age where there's so much information that can get out, there's a lot of general managers, there's a lot of management types that want to stay as close to the vest as they can with regards to the team. And I think Ron Hextall was certainly that way. He's a guy who tried to keep it close to the vest. And, that pretty much summed up his style. And, it's something where, he comes out and, he wants to keep everything limited. I mean, yeah, they're, if you're hiring, Gord Murphy kind of as a mole and just, keeping an eye, literally being the eyes and ears, in the locker room. I mean, something like that that's pretty sketchy as far as I'm concerned. And that's something that, that there's no quicker way to alienate your players than by doing things like that. And, you look at, how guys have struggled like Gostisbehere and Provorov, and you have to figure that kind of makes sense, that kind of lines up at, there's no trust in Gord Murphy anymore that he can really represent their interests. And that's something that, it all kind of makes sense at the end of the day. And, I think that with Fletcher coming in, he's definitely going to want some kind of level of control here. He's going to have to establish control in some kind of way. And it's something where, I mean, as far as the comparisons to Sam Hinkie and Chip Kelly come along, I mean, it's something where you have a guy who's trying to, put his blueprint on things, trying to put his rubber stamp of approval on just about everything. And it's something where, he's looking to, get all that coverage, just try to cover his bases as best he can. All Ron Hextall really wanted to do was build a contender, and he wanted to try to do it his way. And unfortunately, that's what cost him at the end of the day. And it's something where, you look at how everything went down with him, and I've actually, it's interesting that it did all come out, after he got fired. I thought for sure somebody could have left the organization, within the past couple months and said something about it, or leak that out in some kind of way, and it's something that, you have to figure it's probably a lot more common in pro sports than we think it is, but it's still, you look at it and you wonder how that kind of behavior can be allowed to sustain for so long.
Well, first of all, to go back to Gord Murphy and all that stuff about being the eyes, I mean, like, it takes the word Spygate to a whole new level here. I mean,
Yeah, for real.
to have a guy who's actually essentially spying on players to try to make sure they're doing whatever it is. I like your point there about it coming out so early and how it's something like this is something that could have hung over the organization for a while. You wait until Hextall's long since gone and things like that. I'll tell you why I think it came out when it did, or as it was going on. I think it came out because of the fact that, when it comes down to it, this is a city that looks for the answers. I think that when it comes down to the media and it comes down to the way that teams are covered in Philadelphia, you look for the answers right away. And to be quite honest with you, Rob, I think you brought up a really good point, because the Colangelo thing didn't even cross my mind at first, but it is in a weird way. Talk about how the two teams that share a building have each gone through some sort of crazy, not scandal necessarily, because I don't think there's anything overly scandalous to this, at this stage, because it's not like we knew anything leading up to a decision. It's not like, it's not like Brian Colangelo has burner accounts, so that's why he got fired. It's I think it was a whole bunch of collective issues that got Ron Hextall fired that ultimately, as we started to learn following, it was, well, he did this and he wanted this and he said this and he had these people do this kind of like all of a sudden it just kind of gives you some clarity towards why this was the guy who had to go first, if that's where all this came from. Um, no, I'll add something else too, because I want to get your take on this, because I wrote about this last week also, and I posted this kind of midweek as Ron Hextall was on his way out. The idea was we didn't know what was going to happen to the coaching staff, but it was kind of an idea I had after the next wave of changes, after Chris Pryor and Gord Murphy were gone too, and it was kind of like, you felt it being a start. You felt it being, okay, the GM is gone. They took the assistant GM too, or got rid of the assistant GM too. So now that management box is completely empty, with the exception of Barry Hanrahan, who is the only other assistant GM within the organization at the moment. And as far as we know, everything could change now that Chuck Fletcher's been hired. But regardless, those two were gone and an assistant coach was gone. And you're sitting there going, there's two assistant coaches and a head coach. And then there's the only, there's not much higher else you can go than Paul Holmgren and then ownership. That's all that's left. And the thought that I started to have was, should the Flyers just ultimately clean house at some point? We've already talked about the coaching staff to some extent. And you know what? I don't know that Dave Haxtell is going to keep his job or lose his job in the next few days, weeks, months, whatever it may be, because he's probably going to get a fair shot to prove he deserves the job in some capacity, to maybe coach the way that he would like to, as opposed to the way that somebody maybe wanted him to. But regardless, he's not well liked in the city right now because of the way the records show. He's, and the way the team plays on some nights too. That goes into it as well. And you've got a lot of free agent coaches out there that may not last very long, and you'd better be sure. That's kind of the thing. Like, you better be sure if you're going to let this guy hang around long enough. You better be sure. And not to mention that a new GM kind of likes to give his say. He wants to pick his people, pick his head coach and let that guy roll with it. The thing about Dave Haxtell at this point is that if Dave Haxtell's fate is going to be decided by Chuck Fletcher, and therefore the assistant coaches have their fate decided as well, then the only guy who's really left after all of this is Paul Holmgren. Paul Holmgren's been with the organization for over 40 years in some capacity. He's played for the team. He was an assistant coach. Then he was a head coach. Then he was in all sorts of management and front office positions, director of scouting, director of player personnel, assistant GM, team president. And it's like, you know what? Where has the team gone in 40 years since Paul Holmgren's first season in 1976? I can tell you the one thing they haven't done since then, and it's the one thing that people like to remind Flyers fans about, that they haven't done since 1975. So maybe that was the way to go. Maybe you just get everybody out of here and really get that fresh perspective. And it was so ironic to me because, I mean, we weren't doing the podcast at this time or anything like that. I don't even know if we weren't even really the primary guys writing on, or Sports Talk Philly wasn't even really as much of a thing at this time. But 5 years ago, go back 5 years, when the idea was to bring in Ron Hextall, and it was actually before Ron Hextall. They had fired Peter Laviolette and let Craig Berube take over as the head coach. And at that point, Paul Holmgren was still the GM. Ed Snyder was still alive, obviously, and Ed Snyder was asked at that very given moment, does this organization need a fresh perspective? And he was very adamant about it. No, we don't need one. Like, we don't need to have a fresh perspective. And all of a sudden, it's now sounding like that's exactly what they needed. And 5 years later, nothing has changed. They still need the fresh perspective. What do you think, Rob? Do you think that they should have used that opportunity to not necessarily completely clean house? I mean, I think that going from the top would have been certainly making a big statement, but I'm also talking about the idea of eliminating, Chuck Fletcher's kind of a breath of fresh air to an extent. We'll get into more about Fletcher as a GM in a moment, but the idea is that he's a breath of fresh air just because he came from another organization and several others that, he wasn't a Flyer. He's not a guy who's been a Flyer before. We hear all about that, things like that. So is the idea that eliminating former players from this, was that the right idea, or would that have been the right way to go, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's something that the outside voice is definitely crucial. It's because you look at how hard the Flyers have worked to try to win that Stanley Cup, and just how far they've come, and just how snake bitten they've been. You can even make that argument, and it's something that it's when you're trying to solve a problem, at work or at home, or you have a hobby, you're putting something together, you're building something, and you're not able to figure it out, but then somebody else kind of takes a look at it and is able to help. Sometimes you just need a second set of eyes to look at things, and that's no different with the Flyers. And I mean, Fletcher's a guy who his background I'm a little skeptical of. You look at what's happened since Minnesota, or since he took over Minnesota in 2009. He misses the playoffs for his first 3 seasons, and then he can't get out of the second round. You look at the Flyers, who haven't been able to get out of the first round within the past few years. But you look at the teams that he's lost to his Wild teams have lost to in the playoffs. You lose to the Blackhawks in 2013. That was right in the middle of the Blackhawks dynasty. They lose to the Blackhawks yet again in 2015 when the Blackhawks went to get their third cup. You have them losing to last year a powerhouse Jets team. The Blues, the Stars, and so it's one of those things that he kind of ran into some tougher teams. The Wild kind of ran into some tougher teams in the playoffs, and his draft strategy, I'm a bit miffed on as well. I mean, obviously, some bigger names that the Wild have been able to get in the past few years. Matt Dumba, and then some younger guys who are making an impact on the team right now. Jordan Greenway and Joel Eriksson Ek. But it's something that that's honestly, I'm a little skeptical over the Chris Pryor firing as well. It's something that he's a guy that he's been pretty influential within those drafts, and it's something where obviously he's falling because he's collateral damage. He's Ron Hextall's right hand man, so it's something that losing him is a tough one. But especially when you have Fletcher, whose draft past few drafts have been kind of spotty. It's something that having Chris Pryor around would be good to help with that as well. But I mean, if you're able to, see what he can bring in, see if there's any guys from his staff that he can bring in. You look at other guys that are, if he wants to overhaul the coaching staff a little bit, it's something that it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. I mean, if he wants to stand pat for the next few weeks, like he did say that earlier, that he wants to kind of keep an eye on things, see how they are for now. He said that he has a lot of respect for Hackstall, which, obviously, he was going to say that anyway, but I think that is critical because at that point, it's something that, yeah, the new GM is always going to want to bring his guy in behind the bench, but it's something that just the distraction of it all, of just having a lame duck coach where he knows that time is limited for him. It's something that if he's able to come out and say that Hackstall's job is secure for at least the next few weeks, that's good because that puts that distraction to bed. And you look at that game on Saturday against Pittsburgh. It looked like the Flyers were playing with house money at that point. It looked like they were playing for Hackstall. It looked like they were playing with nothing left to lose. That if it was the end for him, they wanted to get him out on the best note that they could. And it's something that I mean, we'll see how that goes. I mean, I obviously, the assistants. I think that that they all had to go for the most part except for Chris Knobloch. But it's something that when you look at it. I mean, at least Gordon Murphy's gone, but things will be overhauled at some point, sooner or later. So we'll definitely see how that goes.
You had a nice segue there, Rob, with the idea of Fletcher's kind of way of some of his past GM moves and some of the things that he's done throughout. I agree with your stance on his drafting ability in recent years. He actually kind of, when he started with Minnesota, he actually started out on some pretty high notes for the most part, because he mentioned Matt Dumba. In 2010, his first round pick was Michael Granlund, and his second round pick was Jason Zucker, and they're two guys who have stuck with Minnesota for the entire time, essentially. So they were good moves as well. And truth be told, also 2012 hits, and it's the offseason of 2012, the summer of 2012, and Minnesota's missed the playoffs for 3 straight seasons. There's not a lot of interest around the team. Is the scenario starting to sound familiar? Yeah, the Flyers made the playoffs last year, but winning takes care of the people being interested, So When there's not much interest around Minnesota, what does Chuck Fletcher do that offseason? He goes out and he makes 2 big-time free agent signings in Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. Now, have both worked out completely? No, because both have had their injury struggles at times. Those were massive deals that cap strap a team, and I don't think that you can. I honestly don't think that in this day and age you can approach any free agency move with that kind of aggression, with a 13-year deal and nearly $100 million contract. You can't do that anymore. But I do think that you can focus on bigger names and try to work out the best deal possible and be negotiable in those things. It's not, and again, that's not to say that over the last offseason the Flyers didn't reach out to John Tavares' camp and say, hey, are you interested? And if he said no, he said no. But maybe you push a little harder and push back a little harder and let the money talk a little bit if you've got some of the money, That's all. I mean, it's not saying strap yourself down by any stretch. That's not the way that they should go. And if this is what Fletcher does, then he's setting the whole organization up for issues down the road. But if you have some of the cap space, it is a resource, as Fletcher mentioned earlier on Monday. It's a resource. Put it to use if you can get a guy. If you don't, then you don't. It's just, but put it to use. Some of his other good moves, and I think one of the things that works for what you were trying to say also, Rob, is that if you push the coaching decision aside and like he did and say, I'm not going to make any rash judgments on this guy. I have respect for him. I want to see what he can do, and we'll make, we'll make an evaluation later. One thing that I think is very telling about that is that the outside perception of Dave Haxtell is still the college coach, not the NHL coach. When Fletcher was asked about Dave Haxtell and the respect he has for him, the answer was about how every time we got a UND prospect, he always came around. He always developed the right way. Well, that's great. It's great that these kids from North Dakota worked out when they made it to the NHL, and with the proper development, they were good players. But what does that say about the coach necessarily? It doesn't say it's a ringing endorsement for the coach at the NHL level. It's a ringing endorsement for the college guy who was at North Dakota for 11 years. That's what that says. Back to Fletcher for a moment, because some of the other good moves that he's made in the past is, he's not afraid to be bold, as we've been seeing before. And that was, even Minnesota's owner said that, that this is a guy that Philly's going to love. They're going to like how he's going to be the right guy for them. He's exactly what they need right now. That's what was being said about Chuck Fletcher. And when you think about some of his trades, again, early on, making a trade for Nino Niederreiter that only cost a 4th liner and a 3rd round pick, making a trade for Devan Dubnyk that only cost him a 3rd rounder. Those are very cost-effective moves that solve your problems. Minnesota had a goaltender after that. Minnesota had a good offensive player after that. That Niederreiter scored 20 goals per year in the last 5 years. So those all work out. If there's any area where Fletcher was poor, it was with the way that he got aggressive after the fact. What I mean by that is he'd either give up on prospects a little too soon for everyone's liking, or he would make the move that you would think was the right one to put the team over the top, and it wasn't. So 2 of the moves I'm talking about when it comes to prospects are in 2010, I think 1 year after he had drafted him, he trades Nick Leddy to Chicago to get the 3rd overall pick from 2004, who ended up being waived a year later. It didn't work out, and Nick Leddy's part of Chicago and winning Stanley Cups. He traded Brent Burns, and Minnesota had him for several seasons. He was kind of an under the radar player when in Minnesota. They trade him to San Jose. And look, at the time, was it probably an even deal on paper? Probably. They got Charlie Coyle and Devin Setoguchi plus a 1st round pick. The idea was that Setoguchi was a really good goal scorer at that time and never found that goal scoring success in Minnesota. He had off the ice issues, apparently, all sorts of things. Coyle has been a very good depth player for Minnesota, but he's not the star guy by any stretch. And the 2011 1st round pick was on a prospect that didn't work out. So you know what? That was a trade that came back, and obviously Brent Burns is an all-pro, multiple-time All-Star, Norris nominated, Norris winning, I believe, even too. All those things. He made a trade for Jason Pominville signed him to a 5-year extension down the road, and then traded him away during the offseason before the 2017-18 season for Tyler Ennis and Marcus Foligno. That's change for a guy like Pominville, who was scoring goals on the regular before in Buffalo before he came to Minnesota, then struggled to score. And guess what? So far this year, last year with Buffalo, Pominville had 16 goals, which is still lower than the 20 a year he was kind of averaging, but he's got 9 already this season in 27 games. Obviously, something's clicking there, and Pominville's playing, like he's back in his prime again. There was the deal with Vegas. Not too recent, but one recent draft pick, their 2014 first round pick, Alex Tuck, and Eric Halla. And Halla goes out and scores 29 goals last season. He's had an injury-plagued year so far this year, so he's not scoring near as much. He has just 2 goals. But Tuck's been great, especially this season. Tuck scored 15 goals as a rookie last year and then has 8 goals and 20 points in 20 games so far this season. He's been great. And really, the only other move that we have that is highlighted as so much is the only other one is the one that people kind of talk about as the one that really did Fletcher in during his time in Minnesota, because Minnesota was on their way to what people thought was going to be a Stanley Cup run in the 16-17 season, and Fletcher made his win now move, so he thought, and he traded a bunch of draft picks. He traded their first rounder in 2017, their second rounder in 2018, a conditional 4th round pick in 2019, and a prospect for Martin Hanzal and Ryan White from Arizona. And both performed miserably in those last few months of the season, did not factor in near as much in the playoffs either, and Minnesota got bounced in the first round by St. Louis. Those are the moves that get highlighted because they didn't work, and you gave up draft picks to get them. So you gave up your future for 2 players that didn't help you get over the hump. That's where people get critical of roster moves. In the meantime, I do focus on other moves that he made. First of all, just a little footnote, and this is something, by the way, all these highlights, these are the kind of the best and worst of Chuck Fletcher while he was with Minnesota. These are all things that are going in an article that'll be up on sportstalkphilly.com on Tuesday morning, shortly after the podcast is released as well. So you'll be able to read this. There was one, as far as I could tell, one link between Fletcher and the Flyers and his roster decisions or transactions during his time with Minnesota. The Flyers traded Darryl Powell to Minnesota in 2011 for a 2013 third-round pick. The Flyers did not keep the pick. They eventually traded the pick to Dallas, and eventually the pick went off to become a pick for the Pittsburgh Penguins. The player that the Pittsburgh Penguins selected with that pick was Jake Guentzel, who scored 4 goals in Game 6 when the Flyers were eliminated in the playoffs last season. It's funny how that kind of comes back around, and it's what I think is funny is sometimes, in researching some of these roster decisions and moves that Chuck Fletcher made over his time in Minnesota, you'll look and see something about a draft pick in this year or whatever, and you'll go and look for the guy's name and you'll go, oh, I don't even know who that is. That was a guy who never made it or anything like that. Sometimes when it's a mid-round pick, it's a guy who never made it anywhere other than being a minor league guy. You went in and looked at this and went, oh my goodness, Jake Guentzel was the pick that the Flyers got from Minnesota that they ultimately traded away. It made its way to Pittsburgh. That's who Pittsburgh selected by that point. Holy smokes, And the other thing that's not lost me, I know we're talking about how he's giving Dave Hakstol kind of the benefit of the doubt for now, but it's not like Fletcher was afraid to change coaches. He came in 2009, and at the same time, Todd Richards took over the head coaching job. He coached for 2 seasons, and they fired him. Fletcher then hired Mike Yeo to take over the job. Yeo coaches the season for 4 seasons, or for the better part of 4 seasons, gets fired with 27 games left in the 15-16 season. An assistant coach was the interim for the rest of the season, and then he hired Bruce Boudreau. And I went back and I was trying to, because, everybody, there's all these hockey connections and things like that, but when you're hiring a guy and you're getting an outside perspective, sometimes you got to do, not only are we doing research on the guy, but I also just wanted to watch a clip of him, just to see how he sounded, what he spoke like, just to get an idea of his demeanor, his presence in front of the media, things like that. And I found a video clip on YouTube of Chuck Fletcher talking about the hiring of Bruce Boudreau, and it was basically the fact that they were going to hire. At that point, they were hiring a guy with a great resume, a guy who had a track record that you couldn't deny. So you definitely wanted to have a guy like that on your team. What does that say about a Joel Quenneville or Todd McClellan or somebody like that who's out there right now? Dave Haxtell does not have a track record right now. He's got 2 playoff appearances and 2 6-game playoff series losses. He doesn't have any kind of success like that, but Joel Quenneville does. Todd McClellan does, and McClellan doesn't have as much success as Quenneville does by any stretch, but McClellan got teams to conference final. I do also, to point out something else that you were saying, Rob, about Fletcher's time in Minnesota and not getting past the second round. I've always believed in years past, and as I've watched this sport throughout my life and especially in recent years, I've always believed that the Western Conference has always been a little bit tougher than the East sometimes. The East has gotten tougher over the years as Pittsburgh turned into more of a powerhouse, and Washington's been consistently good for all those years and just never really got past it in the playoffs. Columbus has put it together pretty well lately, and you look at what in the Atlantic Division, man, you look at what Tampa is, you look at what Boston is, you look at what Buffalo is becoming, you look at what Toronto has become over recent years. The Eastern Conference has gotten tougher since then, but in all those years that we're talking about, it was really the Western Conference that was the tough, having to play Chicago multiple times a year or having to play San Jose multiple times a year. San Jose was a good team then. Having to play the LA Kings multiple times a year was difficult. It's those things. You want to evaluate that situation and go, you know what? There's always tough teams. St. Louis was great over those years in the early part of the decade, that kind of thing. So you wanted to evaluate all of those pieces and kind of understand that, yes, Fletcher didn't get over the hump there, but you wanted to see the body of work and you want to see what he can do with an Eastern Conference team and things like that. My stance is this. I don't think it's a move that you get excited over. I don't think it's a move that you're disappointed over. I think you like the idea of a fresh perspective. You like the idea of an outside voice. And I think you also like the idea of having a guy come in who's never been around this team before, and let's just see what he's got. I said the way I put it is I'm content with the signing. Or with the hiring. I'm content with the way that this could play out. I'm content with the way the situation is once Ron Hextall was fired from it. He's left Chuck Fletcher with a lot of resources, a lot of young prospects. I mean, we're going to really get, especially later this month, I think we're going to get very caught up in Morgan Frost later this month when he's participating in the World Juniors. And because even though the rosters for that are preliminary at this point and there's still all those camps and things like that, Morgan Frost has got 14 points in his last 4 games in juniors. He's going to be on the World Junior roster, and we're going to watch the World Juniors again the way that we watched it in the last few years to see how Carter Hart looked. We're going to watch to see Morgan Frost and to see what he's got and to see how he looks playing against the best young players in the world. And I think we're going to see a lot of things that are impressive. But that's what I'm saying. I want to see what Chuck Fletcher decides to do with all of these pieces. Let's see how he handles everything. And that should be something worth watching for sure. I also, really quick before I go back to you, Rob, is want to touch on, because you mentioned the game in Pittsburgh and kind of how it was like the Flyers were playing with house money, playing for their coach, playing in the event that that's the last game where they're all together. Let's go make it a good one, And I'll say this much. Compared to the game against Ottawa earlier in the week, I thought the Flyers got outplayed against Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh got more grade A opportunities than you'd like to see, and certainly was the more dangerous team. But I think Pittsburgh, for a change, in a situation where the Flyers were basically coming off a week from hell if you're in that locker room or a part of the coaching staff, because you never know what's going to happen. Monday, the GM gets fired. Wednesday, the assistant GM and an assistant coach get fired. Well, what's next? And whenever this guy comes in, what's going to happen? And for a change, I thought the Flyers were not the frustrated team on Saturday. I think that, I thought they got outplayed, but I think that, how many times have we watched the Flyers outplay a team and not get the goals and not get the result? Even the Ottawa game is a fair example. You play 50 great minutes, you take your foot off the gas. It wasn't like Ottawa had a huge push, but a few bounces go the wrong way and you get a few breaks, and Ottawa won with the 2 points at the end of the night. Not not the Flyers. In this game, I thought staying with it and playing a little looser, playing a little bit more for each other helped build up a little bit of character for this team. Something that they need going forward at this point too. You're going to start in December. We get to Thursday when the next game happens against Columbus, and the party's over. Not even the party, but the break is over. This little stretch they had where they played Tuesday, had 3 days off, played Saturday, have 4 days off, and then play Thursday. You're getting a back-to-back over the weekend against Buffalo, who is proving to be a tough team this year, and Winnipeg. Good luck. And then you're going to go into the following week with the rest of this Western Canada trip, which is going to feature Calgary, who has been surprisingly good, Edmonton, who has been on the rise since their coaching change, and Vancouver, who's been kind of up and down. But Vancouver's got a lot of talented players who can certainly expose you, one being a very possible Calder Trophy finalist. All those things factor in. So that's kind of the what's next to the deal. And I want to see, I wonder if that's the timeline for guys like Dave Hakstol at this point with Chuck Fletcher. What's the sense of doing anything crazy or rational here on Tuesday morning, making a coaching change or a player change just to make it, and then going into games against Columbus, Buffalo, Winnipeg, and all that. At this point, let Hakstol coach out the Western Canada trip for sure. Maybe let him coach out the month of December. If it comes to it, the perception is that, Dave Scott flat out said after, and it wasn't during the press conference portion, but after the press conference, that when Joel Quenneville got fired, it was brought up. Chuck Fletcher knows the Quennevilles. His father, Cliff Fletcher, who's a Hall of Fame builder, was the one who hired Joel Quenneville for his first coaching job. So there's a history between the Quennevilles and the Fletchers here. And Joel Quenneville could still very well be the first choice for the Flyers as their head coach at some point. The idea is, though, is that if Joel Quenneville wants the time off right now, then there's no reason to not give Dave Hakstol a shot here. If you're going to get time and there's nothing holding that back, put your focus on what Dave Hakstol can do for this team and let him coach this team for a few games and see where it goes. If the results start tanking and you're going right back to the bottom, if you're going right back to the bottom of the standings like you were before, then maybe it's time to make another decision. Maybe it's time to get somebody else in here, because Chuck Fletcher has come out now and said he thinks this team should be a playoff team this year. Now you've set the bar, you've kind of set the bar here a little bit in terms of you've got to start seeing progress. If the new GM of this team thinks that in its current state, with the exception of maybe getting some stability in goal, which he did point out, that you think that you could be a team that can make the playoffs, you have to start showing it. And if you don't, more changes are going to come, because he's going to make it happen, and he's not afraid to do stuff like that. And Rob, I'm not sure if you saw this either earlier today, but it appeared that in addition, there's no confirmation on this yet. We might find this out tomorrow or on Tuesday when there's a practice. But it looks like the Flyers are adding a new assistant coach as well. And it's one with a couple of ties to both the head coach and the new GM. Rick Wilson is the name here, and he's a veteran defensive coach. He's coached for the better part of 30 years. He actually retired from coaching during the last offseason, but I guess he's coming out of retirement here to help the Flyers here. He was previously part of North Dakota years ago, he was a defenseman, and then he's been a long-time assistant coach in the NHL, including a time with Minnesota. So a lot of things there, and he's supposedly going to join the team this week. So the idea is that there might be a new assistant coach. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that as well, Rob.
Yeah, I did want to touch on that, because that's an interesting move as well. It's something that, he's a guy who, he's one of those guys who's been around a long time, spent a lot of time behind the bench. I mean, he's only had, part of one season as a head coach with Dallas back in 2002, but, he's a guy who's been around for so long. He's a guy who knows the game, and, he knows how Fletcher's going to be doing things here with the Flyers. And, he's somebody that, what I am curious as to how that's going to work is because he's worked in Minnesota for so long, and he's worked with the St. Louis Blues, and I want to know if that's something that could be a bridge to potentially bringing in Mike Yeo, the former coach in Minnesota and St. Louis as well. I mean, that's something that's obviously worth keeping an eye on. But he's a guy who's been around. I think he's definitely a good change of pace for the defenseman, and somebody that obviously, I mean, he's been retired for the past couple months. I mean, it's something that you don't know if it's a situation where he's missing the game that much, or if he really feels like he can make an impact and make a difference here. And that's something that's it's an interesting move, and we'll see how that develops. I mean, like you said, nothing's been confirmed. That's something worth keeping an eye on. Something we'll probably hear more about as the week comes along.
I mean, he's well respected across the league for sure. And I mean, if you're going to be an assistant coach in some capacity for 30 years or coaching for 30 years in the NHL, you're going to earn respect. One of the things that always, or not always, but one of the things that to me comes up in this or plays into it for me is, the opportunity to work with a lot of young defensemen has to be appealing. To have Ivan Provorov, Shane Gostisbehere, Travis Sanheim, the prospect of working with a Sam Morin and a Phil Myers down the road, those guys as well. So many young defensemen coming in. And you know what? I'll say this too. As I watched the game against Pittsburgh on Saturday, and like I said, I thought the Flyers got outplayed, but showed some character in staying the course of the game and not letting, look, you need a goaltender to make some saves for you. And Anthony Stolarz was tremendous in that game on Saturday. He was playing the way that a lot of people thought he could at the NHL level, and we're just waiting to see. That's one. You looked at the defensemen, and it was nice to see Robert Haig stepping up and Andrew McDonald stepping up too. I mean, those are guys who were stepping up because Shane Gostisbehere and Ivan Provorov had terrible games in Pittsburgh. They really just didn't play well. It was smart on Dave Haxtell's part to split that pairing up during the second period when it really felt like it wasn't working, and to at least see where it goes from there. But maybe now, and look, I wonder if that has something to do with the whole Gordon Murphy thing too, of how much that gets into the head of an Ivan Provorov or a Shane Gostisbehere. If Rick Wilson can come in and basically tell these guys, or allow these players to just go and play their game, have some structure, but play your game. Shane Gostisbehere is an offensive defenseman. He's a mobile guy. Go play your game. Ivan Provorov is a guy who can do both ends of it, but you almost wonder if Ivan Provorov's trying too hard to jump into the play a little bit too much. He got caught on that 2-on-1 at the start of the game in Pittsburgh. Like, he wants to make things happen offensively like he did a year ago, but you can't just make them happen. You've got to pick your spots, and if the spots are there on multiple occasions, you do it, and if not, your first responsibility is towards your own netminder. And I feel like he's lost a little of that this year. I don't think there's not an ounce of me that believes that either of them is playing with an injury right now. I think that they are just a little bit in their own heads. And if they can get out of their heads and just start playing a little bit, that they would be much better off, and they will have the success that we've gotten used to seeing them have over the course of the last few years. But other than that, I mean, everything else with this team, just let's see how it plays out. It's really hard to criticize the players specifically on anything when you feel like that they've had a lot going on mentally, the way that the locker room was run. Let's see what happens when you take that big portion of this out of the picture. If this loosens this team up a little bit, like I said, I think Saturday's game was a looser version of the team a little bit. Not to say that there was a little bit of fun, but you go, you sat there and you watched the first 40 seconds of the game. Pittsburgh scores a goal, and you're going, "Oh goodness, here we go again." It's going to be just like the playoffs. And I'll tell you what, my mindset going into that game as I was preparing to watch it was get ready, because I think a 5-1 blowout's coming. And with the way that Pittsburgh played, they could have scored 5 goals, but the Flyers managed to score 4 by the way that they played and the way that they stayed with it, and they played a very dedicated defensive game. To an extent, you're giving up a lot of chances, but you played a dedicated game, and especially, penalty kill. You had only one penalty kill in the whole game, and you scored a goal off of it. You scored a goal. It wasn't just a goal too. It's Dale Weiss scored a goal, a shorthanded goal. Holy smokes. You're getting contributions from different people, even the way that, they had the in between lines. So Jake Voracek's on the ice with Claude Giroux for a brief period. That helps lead to a goal. Travis Konechny gets a breakaway with some good passing from the defensive zone. That's a goal. All these things start to work into the Flyers' favor a little bit. Maybe they can start not just getting some bounces, but if you can start getting everything put together a little bit, get some more structure in there and clean up some of those areas where the odd man rushes come into play. And we'll see how that looks against Columbus and Buffalo and Winnipeg. And you go through that week and we'll see where, let's see where they stand after 3 games here and then maybe 3 more, and just go very small portions here with this team. See where they can go with this from here. And at the very least, with a fresh perspective in mind here, you're not going to see a guy sit around and let it play out. That's what I think one of the biggest things with Hextall was, that it could have gotten as bad as it could be, and Ron Hextall was probably going to let it play out because he had a vision and felt they were getting better. I don't think that that's the case with Chuck Fletcher. I think he's going to be that kind of guy for the first week or so. And then after that, as you get closer to the end of December and now you're pushing halfway through the year, he's going to have to start making the tough decisions at some point in time. And it just depends on what those tough decisions are, whether they're player related, coaching staff related, or otherwise. So we've got about 5 minutes left in this week's show, and we've obviously touched on a lot of different things from Ron Hextall and the aftermath of his firing, the different things that have come out about him, the comments from Paul Holmgren and Dave Scott, what little there was from that press conference that we could actually feel like we could take as concrete and as solid answers. But then in addition, the additional moves that were made with Chris Pryor and Gord Murphy, the press conference that Hextall had where he kind of denied everything or didn't feel like that was true, the follow-up to all of that where there was even more speculation that we have started to perceive to be potentially true, and Chuck Fletcher joining the team. There's a lot of pieces here, and it's like we said, Rob, it's a busy week and weekend coming up for this team. I mean, it's 3 games in 4 days, and they're all difficult games. What at this point, are you just looking for kind of not necessarily a carbon copy of the game in Pittsburgh, but the idea that the effort and the a little bit of heart too. I mean, with the way that from Wayne Simmons dropping the gloves early in the first period to the way that the team kind of stayed the course right down to their goaltender, that's the kind of stuff you're looking to see moving forward if this team's going to be any form of successful this season.
What I'm looking forward to is how the team can play, under Hextall. If Ron Hextall was on everybody's rear, as these rumors suggest that he was, that's got to be a sigh of relief for Hextall, and that's got to be a sigh of relief for the rest of the players. And it's something that I'm curious to see how they go about that. If it's like, hey, like we can finally do our thing. If Hextall finally has a little bit of wiggle room now, he can try to coach to his strengths, because he's still known these players a long time. And he's somebody who can find a way to tailor himself to their strengths. So I am kind of curious to see how he does. I mean, obviously he's got something to prove at this point. Whether or not he can stick around for the long term, or whether or not Fletcher's going to bring in his own guy. And it's something that they're looking to play for him as best they can. I mean, obviously, we still got to see how things can look, as far as trades are concerned, if anybody can, gauge any, sort of value or anything like that. So it's interesting to see how that'll play off. And, you don't have that looming threat of, Ron Hextall's alleged authoritarianism hanging over everybody at this point. So it's something that, I'm curious to see how he does, now that Dave Hextall can kind of be himself a little bit. I'm curious to see how he can do things.
I'm a little curious to see that as well. And I'm also, I feel like the first thing that we're going to see is Chuck Fletcher put more focus on maybe trying to find a solution to the goaltending issue here first. And I mean, look, if you're asking me, I think the short-term answer is Anthony Stolarz. I think the long-term answer is whether or not Stolarz gives you continued great performances, or whether or not you get everybody back healthy sooner rather than later, or if you find a better option. That's probably more the long-term answer. I mean, look, the real long-term answer is Carter Hart, but the more and more I see things, the more and more I think Carter Hart's going to spend this year with the Phantoms. Not taking anything away from the kid for sure. Hart went out and played Sunday, and it was a treat when the NHL Network shows a Lehigh Valley Phantoms game, and Carter Hart got to start too. And this was a game against the Toronto Marlies, the team that knocked the Phantoms out of the playoffs last year, went on to win the Calder Cup. That was also the best offensive team in the league, I believe, to that point. And the Phantoms go in, win a game 5-2, and not only go in and win the game, but Carter Hart looks tremendous in this game and looks like he's really starting to show signs of turning the corner. You let him keep developing, let him keep building his confidence. But beyond that, maybe find a solution. The other thing we've got to look forward to here is, in addition to the games that are going to come up where we can kind of see what Hackstall's all about and get a better feel for him potentially. I mean, look, we could see the thing about Dave Hackstall is we could see the exact same thing we've been seeing and find out that that's just still his system. And Ron Hextall didn't change much when it came to the system. Maybe he changed the lineup. Maybe he had more say in the lineup. Who knows? But perhaps we're going to find out that Dave Hackstall's system is still his system. That's also a possibility. Here's what I will say, though. We've got the 3 games this weekend to really find out, to get a feel for it, and to see how the team handles themselves, especially after a very big win against Pittsburgh. That's one that gets the emotions running a little bit. And just get you fired up for the next time out. We're also supposed to be, as far as I know, I believe the press conference that will introduce Chuck Fletcher as the new GM is going to be Wednesday morning or early afternoon, something in that range. So look for that as well. We'll finally get to hear from Chuck Fletcher and get an idea of what he's all about as well, or more of an idea of what he's all about, and see what else maybe he has in the works or his plans for the team or anything of that nature. But it's certainly going to be an adjustment process in the early going, but it should be interesting to see how the Flyers operate under a new voice, somebody who does not have previous ties to the organization. Should be very interesting. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Flyerdelphia podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Flyerdelphia podcast. Again, we're on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Also, remember to check us out on SoundCloud as part of the Sports Talk Philly podcast network. Remember, you can listen to us and the rest of the shows on the Philly sports scene. And boy, is it a busy time in the city right now. The Phillies Nation podcast on Sports Talk Philly, covering the Phillies, who made a fairly big trade of their own and are involved in just about every free agent you can imagine during the baseball offseason. The trade was officially announced, I believe, about 30 minutes before the Flyers put out the official release on Chuck Fletcher. So big things happening with the Phillies. The Pick Swap pod covering the Sixers, who are on a little bit of a roll right now, certainly experiencing some success since the Jimmy Butler trade. And the Kelly Green Boys covering the Eagles. As we're recording this on a Monday night, the Eagles are playing a home game against the Washington Redskins, with every game holding a lot of meaning. A win could keep them alive in the divisional race, in the playoff race, and we'll see where that goes. But certainly follow those guys as well. Great conversation on all 4 Philly sports. So thank you for tuning in. For Rob Riches, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com. This has been the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heening.